All right, so now we're going to take a higher ed perspective, and we have a all-star panel here, which I will let our moderator introduce. But our moderator is none other than Kathe Pelletier, who is the director of EDUCAUSE's Teaching and Learning Program. Long story, but what was IMS now, One EdTech, actually came out of EDUCAUSE many, many years ago, and EDUCAUSE is really probably still our premier partner in many ways. And Kathe, I can't thank her enough because her major teaching and learning program conference was just last week. And in fact, there's a virtual session that's happening tomorrow. So she came here just to help us with this panel. We really appreciate it. So let's hear it for our higher ed panel.
Hi, everybody. I'm still really processing all of that rich input from our students. And that's really what we're here to talk about today with these product leaders is how do we take what we're learning from our students who are in high school, middle school today and use that now to plan for the next 5-10 years as they'll be quickly entering into higher education. So I'm going to share a little bit about EDUCAUSE and the work that we do in this space. However, we are not yet asking students of this younger age what their hopes and dreams are, what they really enjoyed, and how they were engaged in their education experience. But I want to do a little bit of a commercial for our Students with Technology report that will be due out this August, September-ish. Some of you may have caught the session this morning with Janae Robert and Mark McCormick, who discussed it. But there, we're really excited to hear from what students in college now really care about in terms of accessible technology that is reliable and does the job for what they need to do with their classes, as well as students' views on privacy and security. And it will really be a great tool for education providers to think about how they're investing in equitable and effective learning experiences. So I'm going to ask my presenters here next to me, these product leaders, to say hello real quick, and then we'll launch into our conversation.
Great. Hi, I'm Steve Rogalsky, Vice President of Product Management at D2L. I came into this education community from the product world, and I feel like I have found my friends and my family here, so thank you.
And hello everyone, Chris Husser, Vice President of Product at Anthology. Also really pleased to be here today and come to really higher education from working on campus for a number of years in technology and education.
Hi everyone, my name is Chechitelli. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Turnitin. I have been in EdTech for 23 years, which makes me feel old now. So I'm always feel grateful and blessed to have been in this industry during this time. It only gets more exciting and excited to talk about this.
Great. Yeah, I know for me, a lot of what the students shared was validating of what I think we know for me and the higher ed community about what students want and need and don't want and don't need, but there were some really new, interesting ideas that were there. I would love to hear from all of you. Let's talk a little bit about what would need to be true in higher education, whether it's on campus or with products, to make these students' dreams come true. What would that look like?
I'll start with a story. It's always fun. So I'm also coming at this now from a parent of 3 teenagers. So it's funny, when I started this journey, I didn't have children, and then I had children, and it changes a little bit your perspective and how you listen to them, and how you should sometimes listen more, and what you should choose to ignore as well, I think is important too. So I went to my son's graduation. It was last week, similar to these students. And there were a few valedictorians, and so the speeches were short. And so one of the gentlemen got up and he's like, I'm super awkward and I don't like giving these speeches. And so I was like, oh, what's this going to be? And then he read this kind of speech about what graduation means and what chapters it opens. And it was, I would say it was a B speech, like your basic speech, nothing too out of the ordinary, somewhat motivational, said the right things. And at the end of the speech, and he said, this was brought to you by AI. So his entire graduation speech was written by an AI bot, right? And it was kind of a point he was making of like, this is, like, is this still my graduation speech? Is this okay? Is this not? So I think that's just a good grounding for us to think about what these students are thinking of and what they're exposed to that we in higher education need to be prepared for, right? And so I think one of the conversations that I continue to have throughout these 23 years is digital literacy, right? And I get frustrated, to be honest, that there's still basic conversations on how to use an LMS when that same conversation took place in 2004. So we have to be raising the bar on digital literacy, but part of that is the training of our teachers, right? And how do we help them? How do we help them incorporate technology and use it? But students expect that, right? Students are not, my kids will come home and tell me when a teacher doesn't know how to use Schoology. Absolutely, will tell me. And that's the expectation of students as they come into higher ed as well. I think we also have to grapple with ethical questions, right? Obviously, in general, across society, but even things, we deal a lot with, authentic work that students submit, right? That's what a lot of Turnitin does. And I don't know if you guys have used, and gals have used Google Docs, and you know how it completes your sentence? Right? It's pretty good at that, right? And I accept those changes a lot. At what point when you're accepting changes to your email, is that email still yours? Well, yeah, they're just completing a sentence that's pretty basic, right? But what if it just completes the rest of the paragraph, right? Is that still your written work, right? And I don't have answers to these, so sorry about that. But those are the types of questions we have to be discussing as a group, like from a digital literacy as well as ethical and AI, and how that impacts education.
Chris or Steve?
I think the question about what would need to happen or what do we need to see in higher education to really be prepared for this type of thing, it really aligns to what Dr. Evans said I think at the end and what her organization is really all about, which is that feedback and that discourse and sharing that data, right? So this is kind of product management 101 for folks like us, or probably some of you in the audience as well, but we'd call it user feedback. Understanding, how do your users use your product, what's working well, what's not working well, where are the hiccups, where's the good UX, the bad UX, constantly getting good at how to use that to tune your product to be better is a lot of what we, kind of think about doing a lot of the times. And what strikes me as I kind of listen to a lot of what the students had to say is where's that mechanism for higher education? Not just on campuses, but particularly from that transition from the K-12, kind of persona, as we would call it, or students, to the higher ed space. I don't know that mechanism is there. So I would love to know and talk to Dr. Evans more about that adoption of her program and what type of institutions are paying attention to this type of stuff. Because there's a lot that, even if you're a director of teaching and learning, for example, I would say this type of stuff to me would be gold to think about. Well, what do I need to do to better prepare my educators in the classroom to meet some of these expectations, or to figure out, have the conversation maybe at least. Yeah.
And it'd be really interesting to see how different high school students' expectations are from college students today. There might be a lot of overlap, but there might be a lot of differences based on what they experienced in their high school.
I love Dr. Evans' talk, and if you look at the title, I don't know if it's here, but probably not there, but Envisioning the Future by Listening to the Ideas of Our Students. I think that's what we need to do and keep doing. And I'll tell you a little story. A few years ago, I started, and I had the privilege of meeting a whole bunch of our clients and going on site with them and doing some virtual workshops, gathering like 6 to 8 students together, 6 to 8 teachers, faculty members, administrators, and running workshops with them. And for those of you in software, you probably run retrospectives at your companies. We ran a retrospective on technology in education. That was the workshop. So a really simple model, you put a sailboat on a whiteboard, you give them lots of Post-it notes, and you ask them 3 questions. Where are you trying to go with that sailboat? Where are you trying to go with education and technology? What are you trying to do? So from a student perspective, things like, I'm trying to get my degree, I'm trying to get great feedback, I'm trying to accomplish these goals I have, whether they're career or life. A second question you ask is, what's helping you get there? So if you got a boat, what are those motors that are pushing you forward, right? And it's, again, feedback was really common from students, from teachers as well. We want to give great feedback to students. We can see how that feeds it. And one of the interesting things was technology that's there and that I can use anytime, anywhere, right? I want to use it anytime, anywhere, not just in my classroom, even if it's face-to-face, but I want to use it anywhere. And then the last question we ask, all right, what are the anchors on that boat that we need to cut? Right? There are things that are slowing you down from trying to achieve your goals, and what are those? And lots of anchors came out, and we asked them to prioritize them. And it's really interesting, after the second student session we ran, we're like, okay, we got the exact same answer every single time. The top priority, the top anchor we need to cut. And we started guessing, all right, the third session, the fourth session, the fifth, are we going to see the same answers? And we did. And it's this. They want to see consistency in technology from course to course. And now it's not exact consistency, but it's the where do I and how do I questions that they want answered everywhere. Where do I find the course material? How do I talk to the instructor? How do I get my grades? Where do I submit an assignment? Those kind of questions, the where do I and how do I, make those consistent across courses. Now I know you're already thinking faculty autonomy, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But I talked to one student in particular who still sticks out in my mind, a student from Minnesota. He was a first year, well, at that point, he was a first year student. He had 2 courses. He was going to school part-time. One, the instructor used the system exactly as some would describe, used the technology well in the classroom. We knew what to expect, and that meant that student could focus on the learning, not the where do I, how do I questions. The other course, the instructor, I don't know, they had just a basic page, didn't use the technology almost at all. The student was nervous, was anxious, they didn't get their grades right away, they weren't getting the feedback, they couldn't access the course material to study for exams and tests because it was all on paper. What if they missed a class because they had to work that day? That produced a lot of anxiety, right? So we're adding cognitive overhead and cognitive load to this student when we really want them to focus on the learning, not these where do I, how do I questions that are the basic things. Now, fast forward 2 years, right? We've had a pandemic. There's a lot more cognitive overhead and a cognitive load on our students. We talked yesterday in the panel, in the keynote about the 4 pandemics, right? COVID, the environment, racism, war. There's a lot more. So everything we can do as a group to reduce that friction, remove sand from the gears, is going to help our students focus on the learning, which is why it's so important to be here and part of One Ed Tech, right? That's what we do here as together, as competitors, as partners, we do that. Standardize to remove the friction. So.
You know, it's really interesting that you mentioned that because I was really kind of parsing in my brain some of the feedback from the students from Dr. Evans' session where the student said, mix it up. I don't want it to be the same, but what I think the difference between what they might have been saying and what you were saying is that they don't want to be bothered with the where do I and how do I, but the content and the activities and the pedagogical aspects, and that frees up the teacher too, yes. Right? So I'm so glad that you brought that out.
And that's where the faculty autonomy is still there, right? You're just trying to set a baseline for the where do I, how do I, but then sure. Give lots of freedom for how you want to engage, how you want to teach.
I was just going to back up the point about the consistency, because we've seen that same experience in terms of collecting feedback from folks with our Blackboard LMS system. And it's interesting because over the years, it started as giving faculty the ability, as you said, the autonomy, but, I want to have a course banner this way, and I want to be able to have my tools this way. And great, here you go, here you go, here you go. And all along create an experience that leads, to a student experience that's like this one. And so in our most recent efforts, driven by a lot of that same type of feedback that we've collected, we're trying to streamline and make it, like you said, it's not the same, but it's, how do we make it more consistent for the students? What I observe, and certainly think about being here at this conference, is that there's still a lot of interoperable tools. I mean, interoperability is great, of course, right? But great, well over here I've got a professor who's using Top Hat, and over here they're using this plugin, and over here they use that one. And so even though we have this rich interconnected ecosystem, I still have a different identity across all of them. I know there's been some sessions here today, or will be, that talk about some of that, but there's still some challenges, I think, around how this kind of vast ecosystem of tools we have, and the fact that there is, whether it's by discipline or just by individual instructor choice, is just inherently going to make it challenging for the students, I think, with your point. Yeah.
But that also gets at the student who made the point about using technology with intention too. Like there might be this vast universe of tools that are interoperable, which is an amazing start, and the more that faculty can really be, on purpose using
that's right.
technology,
she said,
right?
Work it into the curriculum. Don't just make it episodic. But
exactly.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
Right, and you wouldn't want to use Logger Pro in every one of your classes, right? but selectively in the right class.
So, this next question makes me giggle a little bit because it's a little bit like, how do you hide the vegetables in the meatloaf? But what are some of the things that you all think are important to prepare for that our students maybe didn't ask for, that they didn't articulate based on what Dr. Evans shared?
I'll talk to I always go back to the discipline of product management, right? You're always trained very much to look beyond the requests and the wants, because if you just do everything that they explicitly are asking for, you'll have a pretty bad product. Trust me, it happens. You can't have 22 buttons because you were supposed to do everything somebody asked you to do, right? But you look past it and you say, what problem are they trying to solve? Or what problem do they not know they need to solve? And then it's our job to make sure that they're learning to solve for. And that's the key, to kind of look beyond those, ask, why are they asking those things? What do they not know that they should be asking for? And one of the things I think about when like hiring, right? And you think about the skills that people come and how they develop those skills in school to become relevant in their career as well as citizens. And in the past, we always use the word critical thinking, and I still think that's the right word. But what brought home to me, I worked for a few years at Amazon, and there's a lot of hiring there at scale. And the common thing that we spoke about when hiring an employee and whether they were going to, excel, was dealing with ambiguity. And it's sounds like a kind of a weird phrase, but it really sums it up. How will this person deal with ambiguity, right? Because our life's problems are actually quite complicated. It's not black and white, despite what headlines we read. Most things have nuance, right? And school is supposed to teach you how to work through that nuance and how to assess an argument, right? And she spoke about when they were thinking about statistics. I love that, going through a different discipline of how to apply statistics. I mean, when you think about dealing with ambiguity, they're thinking about what data means. So I love that example. And so I think about what they don't know that they need to know, right? So I disagree. I'll say what I disagree with. I disagree that you only need STEM if you think you're going to do engineering. But it's okay. I appreciate his feedback. I'm an engineer, and I write almost every day, right? And I develop arguments on a daily basis. Right? And so these things that we have to teach them, they don't yet know that they need to know. And part of that, and what we do is try to, in addition to feedback, is make sure that students realize the importance of working through those problems themselves. And yes, it might feel easy to do a Google search and get a practice test that's posted on some site somewhere, but long term, that's not good and going to benefit them to develop those skills, right? And so making sure that students are really providing and putting forth their authentic work and their own train of thought is really important for developing them into the future.
I thought it was really compelling how many students articulated that they, and the data, the 80% of students want to do well in school, and how many students were articulating, like, I want to know why this is important so that I can engage with it. And so I love making those things explicit, because otherwise, it is easy to cut the corner maybe when you have a lot of homework to do, or you are not quite as engaged in class as you want to be. And so just making those things really explicit so that kids know what's the point.
It struck me when the one gentleman made the comment about learning the scientific method so you could trust what scientists say. I mean, that was awesome, and the audience obviously reacted too. I'm projecting on him here, so I don't know what was really in his head, but I thought about climate change seems to be such a topic should be for everybody certainly, but for young folks, Gen Z, you see a lot of research that talks about the importance of that, and it strikes me that there's sort of this petri dish, if you will, in the world today. That, I mean, honestly, any of us at any point in our schooling, there was stuff going on in the world. So there's nothing new about that. But what seems to be a little bit different today is you see a little bit more desire for the students to integrate that into school. And I hope that's actually happening. I don't know if that's true. I've been in school for a while, but it just strikes me that the more, I think to your point, if it can be made relevant for the student in the context of what they see going on every day. I mean, I think even our keynote speaker yesterday made a comment about how to take some of the things that were happening that you'd see in the news and the media, integrating that into some of her lecture work with her students. the feedback I think that we see is that they engage with it because it's, not just what they're hearing in the classroom, it's what they're seeing at home, it's what they're feeling personally, potentially impacted by, especially something like, race issues, if not the environment or whatever else. So it just strikes me that, what we're not hearing, I think, is that need for more of that. What we are hearing, as we just got the examples of it, make it relevant for me, but, is it really saying in a very specific way, I need it to be this way as sort of a modality of learning? We talk about, is it online, is it face-to-face, is it hands-on or not? We don't talk about the modality of, is it using examples that are real, or is it a train leaves, Ohio Station at 12 o'clock at midnight on the way to the, those made up assessment examples, and I think there's a big opportunity there.
Yeah.
I was thinking a really good class would be, we talk about climate change, but combining, so they have like environmental science at my kids' high school, environmental science, but also a black period with that in economics, to discuss the impact of some of the climate change decisions and how that impacts economic decisions, right, in terms of what we're looking at in inflation. I mean, these are hard problems, and it makes it relevant for the students, but it's hard for teachers to reinvent their curriculum on an annual basis based on what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things you both were touching on, and in the previous session as well, was the personalized learning that needs to happen, right? And I think that there's two things that K-12 students won't necessarily tell us, is that we might think they had a really robust K-12 education, and there's a lot of have and have not. There wasn't a lot of equity across, especially across, and I'm from Canada, so I'll say nations, but across the world, right? There wasn't a lot of equity, from device access to connectivity access to even the education itself. So they're coming in very different places on the technology side and on the learning side. And you add to that, we're going to have way more students, I think, in the future approaching higher ed as not their first priority. It's going to be their third or their fourth, behind their family, behind economics, behind jobs, behind other things. Both of those two things means that personalizing the learning becomes more important. I know we're already shifting that dial and trying, but I think it's going to even need to increase. I think the Fast Company article I read was saying that 2 years ago, 71% of Gen Z students were thinking of doing a 4-year degree, and that has dropped in the last 2 years to 51%. So those first-year freshmen are going to look a lot more like adult learners who are there part-time and have other needs, right? Not their first priority is education. So we need to figure out how to reach out to them, to reach that every learner, to personalize the experience in every case, to make it impactful for the goals that they have, whether it's, I want to be an engineer, or I need to get a job so that I can, pay for food, whatever that is. But that's, I think, the dial that we need to turn up and is going to keep turning up, is personalizing that learning.
I thought it was surprising to hear at least some of their commentary about how they wanted to push back the sort of discipline track, like I want to start taking things now that are going to be for my college. I feel like the narrative not that long ago was, oh, well, college is where you go and you figure that out. And, now at least, N of 7 here, or maybe a subset of the 7, but giving some views that would suggest, well, no, I kind of know I want to be an engineer now and I want to start taking courses for that. And, we all know, sure, they'll change their major, an average of 3.5 times or whatever that, statistic is. But I think there's something interesting there around how, if that is in fact something they can start getting excited about early, what are those opportunities you can see where it would potentially make the experience look more like, what we would call the post-traditional, more adult education than maybe what we've seen in the past.
Yeah. And would that engage that 50% of students that doesn't feel engaged? That was a startling statistic. And how can we listen to their voices, which I'm guessing the kids that were in these videos were of the 50% who felt like they were engaged. So one of the things that is really important to EDUCAUSE that we have done some research on, and that we publish on and talk about a lot, is digital transformation, and really using technology to transform your institution through coordinated shifts in not just the technology but also the culture in your workforce. And when we were preparing for this conversation, I can't remember which one of you, maybe it was you, Steve, who said, students don't want us to transform, they want us to be transformed. And I would imagine that sentiment will be even more felt more strongly as kids coming from high school and middle school are entering into college. So let's talk a little bit about that. In your product leader role, how are you enabling this transformation?
I think you actually said it well. You talked about digital transformation, and you talked about why it's important. If you look up here, it's important because we want to enable teaching and learning that rises above. We want to invent a better future one at a time. We want to provide insights that foster student success, right? These are amazing, by the way, thank you. This is what digital transformation is about. So talk about these things with your team, right? Talk about listening to students and telling their stories, like the fourth pillar. I got them all, Rob. Right? These are the things here. They don't want to hear, we're going to pick between two universities, and this one is in a digital transformation, and this one's not. They don't care. They care about those things up there. They want a great education to achieve their goals. And that's the story that we need to tell at our companies, at this audience here. It should be in your strategy and your vision documents. You should have videos like this that you play with your team. Like, this is what students are looking for. This is why our jobs and our roles are important, and why I always say D2L is full of not-for-profit employees. We work for a for-profit company because everyone in the company cares a lot about these things. And I know you all do too, because I've talked to some of you this week. We could all be in different industries for sure, but this one's fun because we get to do this transformation stuff and help make a difference. That's what I would do.
At my organization, we talk about it a lot, DX, digital transformation, because we work in the student information system space. We get selected very often to help institutions replace their legacy systems, mainframes, all that kind of stuff. But I think the more interesting work we do is actually on some of the consulting side, to be honest. I mean, yes, our products and services are part of it, but the consulting work, because it gives us an opportunity to have a conversation with campuses, institutions, about how it's not just another project on your master Gantt chart. DX isn't just, great, we need to swap this system out and do this stuff. You have to think about the cultural elements that go along with digital transformation. If you aren't preparing your staff, your faculty, for what comes along with the swapping out of modernization of systems, then potentially you aren't actually really changing all that much at the end of the day. And so I think there's an interesting opportunity, and again, one that we certainly try to spend a lot of time on, and thinking particularly, to wrap it into this topic, the teaching and learning area. How can we help institutions think about the skills that their faculty have, whether it's adjunct or tenure track faculty, either one. How do you help them with that developmental process? And we're able to do that through work that we do with evaluating courses, course evaluation, with digital badging for faculty skill development. So there's a lot of ability to actually use our own kind of services and topics, but in a context that helps create that conversation that says you need to invest in upskilling, reskilling, and cultural change, because those are key elements that often get left out of the DX conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we think about it in terms of very much back to the underlying theme, which we heard from the students, which is the teachers and the engaged teachers, and that's the moment that matters, and that's the moment that stays with the student. And so how do we make more of those moments, right? So from a technical perspective, we say, how do we remove undifferentiated heavy lifting for the instructors? Right? Like there's stuff that they have to do, like admin, right? And the gentleman was like, I hate those first 10 minutes in class when we're just talking about whatever. I mean, personally, I like those first 10 minutes, but I hear his point. And how do you create those things that happen over and over again that you have to do, just done, out of the way? Like in thinking about using AI, using automation, using any of those types of new technologies from an evolution perspective, that we should be able to make it a lot easier and faster so that you're starting with it already, 60% done if you're grading. Like, let's just show you the stuff that you have to look at that's really interesting, right? We were talking about, we were doing some new grading and feedback features for our products, and we were doing customer interviews. We do a lot of customer interviews. And one customer, we always ask, like, walk us through what you do. Like, I'm not going to ask questions, do you like this, do you like that? Walk me through what you do. There was a teacher who had stamps made, I kid you not, like old school rubber stamp with different feedback that they gave all the time over and over again. We can do better, right? Like, that shouldn't have to be the case, right? So you can look to see, for instance, we have like auto grouping, right, for some STEM paper to digital exams, right? So you can take a test that's written, right? Computer vision can lift up question 1, question 2, question 3, can group like ones together and give those to you on a plate to teachers to make quick and easy feedback. That's just one example, but really trying to think about how do we take away the undifferentiated heavy lifting so that teachers have time for the feedback that matters and to engage the students the way they need to.
When I was doing those workshops, the word you just said, the teacher biggest comment was, you said, remove the undifferentiated heavy lifting moments. That's what you said? That was their comment to us. Like, take care of that for us. We just want everything to be easy so that we can focus on being great teachers. That's what I want to be on. And anything that technology does that helps me be a great teacher, that's what we're looking for.
Which is really the experience we're also trying to provide for students, right? We're trying to remove the, like the how do I, where do I, get that out of the way with technology, but then the actual engagement and learning is with the content and with the other students and with the instructor as well. Yeah, and I really, it's been, I'm waxing poetic a tiny bit here, but it's been really interesting in the last few years to see the extent to which the true partnerships between providers and campuses has really grown in ways that I think we didn't necessarily have as richly before the pandemic, that your thought leadership and your expertise in, these are the ways that we can help improve the faculty's experience and, get this administrivia out of the way, or share our expertise and consulting and provide guidance to faculty members as they're teaching. I think hopefully that continues to advance in the coming years as well.
I also think it's always important to think about the differences in additions to age and maturity between K-12 or secondary and higher ed is also scale.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what technology does really well, or should do really well, right? And so it's like 30 kids is probably big in some K-12 classes. Imagine 200, 500, right? And that's just one of your sections, and you might be an adjunct with multiple, right? So for me, I think scale, and I failed to mention that piece of how do we help with scale, I think is going to be more important because it's just so hard. Every faculty I've talked to wants to spend that personalized time. It's not that they don't want to. It's just very hard with those numbers. And also, as schools run more like businesses, schools are always looking to add, can we add another 5 to this section? Can we add another 10 to this section? Because it's margin at that point, right? And so how do we help teachers create that continuous personalization in that situation?
Yeah. And you've touched on the next topic I'd love to talk about, which is how can we actually look to K-12 for their expertise and what can they do to help be prepared for the students of the future as students are graduating and coming to higher ed?
You can go first this time.
Put in the hard one. And that's the right question, I think, right, is what is the opportunity for that connection, right? We talked earlier about, even what's great about Dr. Evans's organization and facilitating maybe some of that conversation. So I think that it's engaging in that. I mean, whether you've got a, kind of tomorrow.org you're working with or not, how do you kind of work with your, even if it's just, who is the local or regional kind of education providers you have, building those partnerships, those foundations to inform that leadership level around, here's what we're seeing. Interestingly, I think from the admissions perspective, and I don't want it to sound like it has a negative tone, but I feel like what I see is that, from an admissions perspective, it's like, the district to me is a, sort of aggregate sort of like feeder, right? This district provides me with students that generally look like this, and this district, and that removes, I think, some sense of what's really happening. It reduces, the output of school districts to just, essentially a cohort of students with an average GPA of X or Y or SAT or ACT scores, whatever it is. And there's so much more going on, as evidenced, I'm sure, by these students alone. And so, how do we bring to higher education, whether the admissions office or otherwise, more understanding that, we're not just a bucket of students that you can average up into a set of scores. What are the actual experiential, in classroom, maybe not like literally one by one, although that could happen with something like the comprehensive learner record, right? But certainly, what are the kind of things that are going on that should inform the next trend or the next sort of wave of needs that need to be expressed by these or shown by these higher education institutions. I don't know that the districts today have those mechanisms in place. I'm not putting that on them either, right? They've got plenty of things to keep themselves busy with, but so we can also turn this around on higher ed. What is higher ed doing to ask, for that input and that feedback, and what are you seeing that would help us better tune our needs? And honestly, there is something here that, and you've touched on it, I think, Annie, which is, and it doesn't sound as altruistic to talk about it this way, but there's economics to this too that you can't lose sight of. And I think there is, if nothing else, even if there's not the altruistic reason, there are economic reasons why it makes a lot of sense for higher ed and K-12 to do a better job collaborating here, to think about the market demand and the more larger the country demand, whatever country it might be, at the end of the day, as far as how do we make sure that we're preparing these students for the careers that we need. And because it doesn't start on the college, it arguably starts in at least secondary, maybe some would argue it's even earlier.
What was the question again?
What can the K-12 folks do to help prepare higher ed for the students of tomorrow?
Yeah, that's such a hard one. And I have a little bit of recency bias, because I have a child going to college in this process that I will put everything back to. I think they can learn about the relationship of the parent in the education, right? And I know that's like, I'm not saying this is a helicopter parent, but like they're part of, 'cause I'm trying not to be. But I mean, in high school, right, in K-12, you are able to have some insight due to a lot of the technology that folks in this room have built, like notifications, understanding, sometimes too much, but there's an involvement that I think K-12 includes the parent in because of the age and in that life cycle. And I feel like I'm sending a child to college and I'm not getting any emails. So they're like, but I'm paying a lot more for this. Like, I'm confused by how little I know. But I think that there's that figuring out the proper relationship and of the parent in that, because I think support is still needed. There's no time in a child's life where they're like, I don't need any support through this, right? And how we think about that. I think that's a thing that higher ed can learn from K-12.
Great.
Yeah, I have to write, my wife and I have to write emails to the professors sometimes for my kids in university. So yeah, there's definitely some parenting still happening, and it's good. I think looking at it the other way, what K-12 is much better at, and we talked about it yesterday too, and I think in the keynote, is pedagogy and teaching, right? So how do we instill more of that into higher ed? And I know it's not an easy problem to solve, and I've talked to a few researchers who are working on that problem. It's very fascinating, but K-12 is better at the pedagogy and places more emphasis on it than higher ed, whereas just higher ed is the knowledge, right, and the expertise. So.
Yeah, I had a lunch conversation where we were talking about, professors profess historically, but teachers teach. And I had a very visceral reaction to that, and coming up from the instructional design and curriculum space. And one thing that I'm really excited about in higher ed is the last few years has really forced into the limelight instructional designers and faculty development professionals, instructional technology professionals. And so I'm crossing my fingers that the value of those roles and working with faculty and support and helping faculty not only profess, but in a way, engaging students in a way that is personalized or active or more engaging, and that will kind of carry the momentum forward, even out of the pandemic, if that ever happens.
It's a controversial topic. The standardization of content, I think, is interesting, right? Like, I would never tell a faculty how to teach their class, right? It's their syllabus. They take a lot of pride and ownership in that they develop and what they want to include in that syllabus. But the lack of standardization between Biology 101 actually is difficult for technology to handle. Like a higher ed, if there were more, be careful what I wish for, if there were more content standardization in higher ed of like what is Bio 101, what is physics, right? And you think they are, and you usually get it from I get it from the table of contents of a textbook. That's usually how the cheater way to do it. But that would actually, more of that content standardization, I think, would actually make technology easier, make it easier for technology providers to do the things for higher ed that we can't do today. Like for instance, like automatic tagging of content. Like that would be great, right? And so that builds data and insights that you can then figure out how the students are doing on certain type of content. But if all the content is always bespoke from course to course, from school to school, it makes it really hard for those types of data and insights projects by which we want that transformation moment. And I think kind of this made me really think, like, what are those things that are different between the two that I think that we should learn from, right? But the lack of standardization, it makes it difficult from a technical provider perspective.
Someone somewhere just yelled about academic freedom,
I
I
know,
think.
I know, but I apologized up front. I gave you all of I know.
It is, though, important because in K-12, if I am a teacher and I create a course and I think it's amazing, even a part of a course, I want to share that with the world, right? And I'm happy to do that. You can use it for free, or teachers pay teachers, and we have some, but happy to share it. And if there was a little more of that in higher ed, in the right context, like intro courses, for example, I think that education would benefit, right? Those K-12 teachers they're just way better at sharing.
I would love to land on that note, but we have several more minutes for each of you to provide, like, what's the one kernel that either you learned from the students today or that you'd like to impart as a product leader? And I'm going to invite you to go first because
Awesome.
you haven't gotten to go first yet.
Years ago, when I was thinking about what I want to do in my career, I was like, someday I want to be a director of listening. Director of listening. I think I ended up in the right role, product management. So that's listening, right? Do a lot of that. If you listen well, you ask great questions, you end up with a much better result and a much better product, a much better education. So that's really, like, I loved the talk before this, and I was at your EDUCAUSE talk early this morning. Like, let's go listen to the people who are doing the work and then react based on that.
I love it.
I think for me, one of the most kind of interesting dyadics in the conversation with the students there and the interplay between them had to do with that kind of whose responsibility is it to create or be engaged? And is it the faculty members, teacher or instructor, whoever, their job, or is it the student's job? And I call it, I said dyadic because I think of it as both, right? That they both kind of have to happen. And so to me, I think then the takeaway becomes, for the educational institution, how are we helping faculty grapple with that? Recognize that there is a role that they need to play, to engage students. I don't know whether it's meeting halfway or 3/4 of the way, or I'm not sure where the line gets drawn. Maybe it's different, and maybe every individual instructor and every individual student has to kind of navigate that, I suppose you could argue. But either way, I don't know that we as the institutions are often engaging in that effectively around, how do you help faculty figure that piece out? And I think part of what is interesting, back to the topic of getting K-12 and higher ed talking more, is that your students have something to say about that, whether in aggregate or individually. But the students in the videos talked a lot about how I have this learning preference, or I learn better this way or that way or whatever. And so, I think about what are the opportunities for systems like any of the ones that our three organizations build to arm faculty with more information about the learner, for them to then use that as appropriate in the context of that discipline and or their teaching style. But that I think is a great example of that meeting in the middle between, we're not hyper-personalizing always to every single learner, but we are at least using all of this data that we're sitting on top of to create potentially a better kind of learning dyadic between the instructor and the faculty and the students.
Great.
Yeah, it's interesting, that relationship. Like, I think it also changes going from K-12 early to post-secondary to higher ed. I do think that in higher ed, you take on the responsibility, I think sometimes of figuring out how you are engaged and motivations for engagement in a way that you might not be as expected to be responsible for earlier on, and having learned that, coming back to the relevancy. I think relevancy is kind of the key for that engagement, right? And how do you make sure those things are relevant to the students? Because, I mean, like it or not, like, there's things in classes they're just gonna have to learn. It's just stuff, right? And we go to work and there's stuff we have to do at work. We just have to do it, right? Like, and so it's balancing that and kind of learning how to self-motivate, I think, is also an important point. But for me, like, I still come back to just digital literacy. And it's not even complex, but just kind of keeping up with, from a teaching perspective, and how, and I don't know the answer of how do teachers balance keeping up with what's changing at the same time they're trying to engage their students and grade and give feedback and do research if they're supposed to. It's just so much, right? But what are the mechanisms that you mentioned that help teachers, higher ed and K-12, but especially in higher ed, understand what's changing and what's out there? Like, I'm sure there's plenty of English teachers who don't know that you can have AI write your essay. Like, happens today, right? And how are we, and what are teaching methodologies that help prevent that, right? And even different tools that allow you to use, machine learning or AI to do that grading for you in a really basic way, so that you can focus on feedback. So I think helping continuously that professional development, I just always come back to that because I still just don't think it's enough. I've never met somebody who's like, oh, you know what, I just get too much professional development in higher ed. Like, I've just never heard that.
Let's do it, more professional development. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk with all of you today.